Here's William Lane Craig to fail to understand how evolution works.
Now, in our last session, I argued that Adam and Eve should be thought of as the most recent common ancestor of both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens.
Why both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? Is it because Neanderthals show evidence of being a subspecies rather than a wholly distinct species?
This traditional view of Adam and Eve as the fountainhead of all humanity has been vigorously challenged by some on the basis of the science of population genetics. And this morning, I'd like to look at this challenge with you. Now, in order to understand this challenge, it's important to understand that according to the theory of evolution, and perhaps contrary to popular impression, evolution does not proceed along an isolated individual line. It's not as though there is some sequence of individual reptiles that evolved, for example, into the first bird. Rather, the idea is that whole populations evolve over time. So the ongoing front of evolution is not like the point of a spear. Rather, it is like a broad front as a whole population of organisms evolves together over time. In this sense, a whole population of reptiles would be evolving bird-like characteristics. Similarly, in the case of human evolution, there is a whole population of hominins, that is to say, man-like primates, which is gradually evolving characteristics of modern human beings. So, it's typically thought there weren't originally two human persons, an original couple that were the ancestors of everybody else. Rather, modern human beings evolved through a whole population of hominins, moving gradually toward some more recognizable modern human forms.
If you look at the genetic diversity of human beings, it is just too broad for everyone to have descended from just two people whose descendants did not interbreed with some surrounding population. If at any time in human history there were only two people who had children who paired off with each other, who had grandchildren who paired off with each other, you'd have a very inbred descendant population that couldn't produce the level of genetic diversity we see in the current human population in less than about 18 million years. And humans just haven't been around that long. Craig tries to get around this problem by speculating that there could have been two first full humans who sprung up out of a population of almost humans. However, their descendants would have had to interbreed with the almost humans to produce the level of genetic diversity we see today.
But why couldn't there have been, within this wider population of non-human hominins, a first couple who made the transition to humanity and whose descendants then became the human race?
The reason why, out of that population, there couldn't be two first individual humans is because those two would have had to speciate from their parents over one generation, and coincidentally speciate into the same species as each other, which would be absurdly improbable. If their parents were just as human, then Adam and Eve would not have been the first humans. But the idea of speciation happening this fast has some problems. One is that speciation, by definition, means accumulating so many mutations that are distinct from an ancestor or cousin population that interbreeding with that population is impossible. That's why speciation has to happen in whole populations and can't happen suddenly in one or two individuals. If Adam and Eve were suddenly of a different species from their parent population, a species unto themselves, they could interbreed with each other, but they couldn't interbreed with members of the population into which they were born, thus reducing the probability of their descendants inheriting the amount of genetic diversity we see today. That's a problem because the only way Craig can get around the genetic diversity problem is by hypothesizing that Adam and Eve's descendants did interbreed with the surrounding population. It's also the only plausible way around the inbreeding problem without invoking magic or special pleading as the young Earth creationists do. Frank Turek, for example, says that inbreeding just wasn't a problem for Adam and Eve's kids because it was only recently after the fall, and the fall hadn't yet caused the genetic problems that are exacerbated by inbreeding. Although apparently those problems didn't start to show up until after several generations of inbreeding done by Noah's kids as well. Craig talks about being human as though once you have a certain sufficient set of genes, you officially cross the threshold into humanity. Evolution doesn't work like that. There is no necessary or sufficient set of genes that definitively distinguishes a human from a non-human. Any attempt to specify such a set of genes would be arbitrary. The distinction between humans and their pre-human ancestors is far too fuzzy for anyone to be able to meaningfully point to a single or couple first members of a human species. Any two members of a population evolving toward humanness would not be meaningfully distinct from their parents with respect to their humanity or membership in a human species. Such a distinction cannot occur over a single generation, which is another reason why you need a whole population of mutations to cause speciation. The idea that there can be a first couple of humans who are distinct in their humanity from their parents is like the idea that there is a specific point at which the ship of Theseus is officially no longer the ship of Theseus. This ship is an old philosophical thought experiment which asks, when you replace parts of a ship, is it the same ship? If you replace a few planks here and there, it seems like it's the same ship, but if you replace every part but one plank, it clearly isn't the same ship. But at what specific point does it change? Any point you specify is always going to be arbitrary. You might say it changes to a different ship at 50%, but how do you even measure that 50%? 50% by mass or by volume? 50% of the total number of components? Any specific answer seems arbitrary. Speciation is like that. You can't point out a single or even a couple of individuals within a population who have just the right amount and kind of mutations to make them a meaningfully distinct category of organism at all, let alone a distinct species. It looks as though there could not have been fewer than 10,000 humans at any given time in human history.
We know that at some point in the past, the number of human beings goes to zero, and therefore to fewer than 10,000 individuals.
Yes, there was a time when there were 0 humans, but no population of pre-humans with 0 humans in it suddenly had 1 or 2 humans in just one generation. The transition was always too fuzzy for anyone, if one were able to observe it, to be able to, at any point, distinguish any pair of individuals that is meaningfully human in a way that the rest of the population into which they were born was not. The distinction between humans and pre-human ancestors is too ill-defined to make a distinction of such specificity possible.
Why don't you just explain how you found, obviously Joshua's work and others, what it was exactly that gave you this insight that actually the population genetic kind of view was not necessarily the only game in town, and that actually there is a way of reconciling the first human couple with the genetics involved.
There were a series of conferences held at the Carl Henry Center at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School on creation. And part of these were devoted to the question of the historicity of Adam and Eve. And it was at these conferences that I first got to know Josh. And he gave a paper at the conference that previewed his book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve. And it stirred a lot of discussion and provoked a lot of interest.
Yeah, so to give a sense of how this is placing, so my book is one critique of Biologos's argument, and it's really parsing out and saying, actually genealogical ancestry is more important than genetics, and if you do that, Adam and Eve could have been very recent.
But if you do that, you have to assume that Adam and Eve popped up out of an existing population with which their descendants interbred, which would mean that they are certainly not a distinct species, nor are they meaningfully taxonomically distinct at all. They would not in any biological sense have been the first humans.
Now, Bill, his view is that maybe there were people outside the garden, but they wouldn't have had full humanness. Like the way how he sees the theology is that humanness is like really exclusive to Adam and Eve's lineage, where I'm not as convinced of that, but that's neither here nor there.
Well, if there were humans outside of Adam and Eve's lineage, then Adam and Eve were not, in fact, the first humans. There would have had to be other humans already around.
Even if the ancestral population of hominins leading to humans remains constantly above some minimal size of several thousand, it doesn't follow that there were not at some time exactly two humans who emerged within that population. It is entirely possible that at some time in the past, the total number of humans was exactly two, even though the total population of hominins at the time was much greater. The descendants of these early humans might or might not have interbred with their non-human contemporaries.
Well, in order to account for the genetic diversity we see, they would have had to have interbred with their non-human contemporaries, which would mean that they could not have fully speciated.
Your view, Bill, that you have now adopted this view that actually it was part of
The hypothesis he's adopted.
Yeah,
the hypothesis, if you like, the hypothesis that you're teasing out here. Is it that the humanness of this first couple is because they genetically, or what is it that marks them out as the first humans, as opposed to their parents or whatever that came before them?
Yes, well, I think I talk about what it means to be human in the book, and I think that they would have to have an anatomical similarity to ourselves. We know that we are human beings, and so using ourselves as paradigms, we would look to see whether or not these ancient hominins were sufficiently similar to ourselves to count biologically as human.
Anatomically, there could be no amount of difference between an individual and their parents, which would allow you to distinguish the individual as human and their parents as not human.
But then what one would look for would be modern cognitive behaviors that would be indicative, for example, of self-consciousness, of symbolic thinking, of the ability to plan for the future and think in abstract categories. And that will be the tip-off that you're dealing there with a person. And it would be a human person because it would be enfleshed in an anatomically human body.
I highly doubt that there could be a clear cognitive difference between one generation and the generation which immediately followed, which would distinguish the later generation as human and the prior as not human. As babies develop, they don't get all of their cognitive faculties at any specific date after birth. They develop gradually. There's no reason to think that the evolution of brains capable of hosting such faculties happened suddenly either. Self-awareness and abstract thought exist on a sliding scale, and I'm not convinced that there's a specifiable level of cognitive ability that would distinguish a pair of modern humans from pre-human parents. It seems rather far-fetched that cognitive abilities could advance that much over a single generation.
So to make a connection here, this is pretty similar to like the Catholic view of like a rational animal, or the way how many Catholics understand Adam and like a rational soul to be unique to Adam and Eve's lineage. Is that right?
Yes, if we think theologically, in order to have a human being, I think you do have to have a rational soul.
If the first true humans became the first humans essentially by virtue of being the first organisms with human souls, then I see no reason why there even needs to be any biological distinction between those first two humans and their parents. If I were an apologist who thought the idea of souls made any sense, I would suggest that the first humans were not distinguished from their parents biologically, but only spiritually. That would be totally non-falsifiable, but the standard of falsifiability never stopped apologists before, did it?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.